This episode is brought to you by the Command Presence Leadership Institute. Find out more by visiting commandpresence.net.
Welcome to the Faces of Leadership with Michael Warren. Be the leader you wish that you had.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Faces of Leadership podcast, where we believe that leadership is about two things. It's about people and it's about actions. We talk with leaders from across society who are stepping up to do what they can, where they are with what they have. The question, though, is what can we learn from them? What can we learn from each other as we strive to be the leader we wish we had? Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Warren, and I'm your host. Thank you for being with us today. And folks, I really hope that you had a chance to listen to last week's episode with Jameson P.B. House, a brilliant man who gave us a peek into leading members of an organization that are often unseen, unheard, and unfortunately, in some cases, they're neglected. I really enjoyed the conversation. I believe that there is something in there for each of us. But today is episode number 9 for the podcast, and as always, I am excited about the guest we have today. So let me tell you a little bit about him. Our guest today is the CEO of Carr Knowledge and the creator of the Education Engine. He is a nationally renowned learning scientist who is also a consultant for numerous Fortune 100 companies, as well as an industry leader in mass media, communications, and learning and development. He is the co-author of Brain-Centric Design and the author of Surprise, The Science and Art of Engagement. Both of those books are in my library, by the way, folks. Everybody, please welcome to the show, Rich Carr. Rich, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate being here and hearing from you again. It's nice to hear your voice.
You know, folks, in the hopes of transparency, I will tell you that I took Rich's class last year, and it was, I don't use the word life-changing very much, but it was life-changing as it relates to the way that I both develop and I deliver training. And I was introduced to Rich by another friend of mine who I look up to immensely, a young man named Joe Willis. And Joe, when he told me about you, Rich, he goes, Mike, you got to listen to what this guy has to say. He knows what he's talking about. And as usual, Joe wasn't wrong.
Well, thank you. That's great to hear.
So, Rich, I just kind of want to jump into things, and I just want to ask you, for the sake of our listeners, what exactly is a learning scientist? Is a brain scientist? What is this all about that you do?
You know, it's been a wild journey, and it's to answer your question quickly. It would be trying to take different models or frameworks of presentation so that the receiver actually internalizes it and does what we want them to. And through this, I was introduced to Dr. Kiran Omani, who you also know, and he is a cognitive learning neuroscientist. And he has, over the last 40 years, done all this research on the learning sciences and cognitive neuroscience, which is a kind of a mouthful, but in a nutshell, the way I like to explain it is rather than trying to present something so people can memorize facts, you want to present something so that you're facilitating a thinking system, because we are not taught to think, really. I mean, some people have the good fortune of maybe learning critical thinking, but you were never really taught to think. You were only told to think, and typically what to think of. So a learning scientist uses these models and tries to disprove them, meaning try to see if there are holes in a particular model. And in the brain-centric model, the one that was detailed in the book Brain-Centric Design, which you spoke of, it is a neuragogic model where it literally helps you prepare what you're going to say, know what you're going to get from the learners after you present it, and gives you a model to present it in the way that the brain processes information. It's literally a breadcrumb map of how to get new information into somebody else's brain to where they internalize it and act accordingly. And accordingly is a big definition. It's the way they would with that particular information. It's not do it my way. It's like, here's this thing, do it your way, and you'll get this result. That's basically what we do. We do this with as you said, different industries, different people. I just got off an hour and a half cohort we've been in for 14 weeks with a Fortune 5, where the entire leadership from the top is now pushing this down down to the ranks, I should say, because you have higher retention, you have higher retention of the material, higher retention of the people in classes, less attrition from folks in the classes. And because you understand it, there's nothing to forget, which is a beautiful way of looking things. It's like riding a bicycle. You could show somebody a bicycle and explain it and talk about all the parts, and in a couple days, they'll forget all that stuff. However, once you learn to ride a bike, you now understand it. You might not be able to name that third sprocket when you switch gears, but you understand how to stay upright, how to start, stop, lean into a curve. That's what we really purport, is how do we get people to understand things rather than recall things from memory.
Would you agree with me? Because I was blown away in the course that I was able to attend that you taught. When we see somebody do something, somebody in our organization, and we go, what in the world were you thinking? And they get this look on their face and they can't articulate it. That's part of the problem. They can't articulate the reasoning behind. And a lot of it, the reason they can't articulate is because we didn't prepare them properly for that.
That's the crux of all problems, really. I mean, it's so funny, and we've heard this in a lot of different ways, where somebody says, get to the point, or what are you talking about, or what's happening here? Typically, it's the person who presented the information didn't really know themselves. They might be the subject matter expert. They might know everything about whatever the subject matter is, but they're just spouting information and they don't have a point, or what we call a big idea. And a big idea is, what will that audience walk away with fully understanding when I'm done presenting? People don't get to that. Well, I'm going to teach them about defense. Well, defense is a pretty broad stroke. I mean, we could say a lot of things within defense. And so part of this cognitive process of presenting information so people understand it and engage in it is presenting it in a way that's all about the learner. It's about them right there at that very second. But prior to presenting, it's really getting all of your thoughts out of your head, making them visible, organizing them in a way that you know what your point is, what your big idea is. And not only that, you know how to measure yourself's success at presenting that. So, for example, if I were to say, okay, Michael, I want to present, how to make a bowl of chili. My goal would be, after I'm done presenting this, that you could make a bowl of chili, just using a very simple thing. However, if I were to talk about chili, I could talk about beans and beef and tomatoes and no beef and Southwest and this and that. And all I would be doing is giving you a bunch of information. So what a lot of people don't do prior to communicating is have a big idea, know how they'll measure the success of delivering that big idea, and then presenting it in a way that the brain processes that information. It's just a slight paradigm shift from being a subject matter expert. And yes, you may know it all, but that doesn't mean you know how to present it or communicate it to another person.
One of the things I found so interesting about the concept and the process was the truly breaking it down into components. Oftentimes, we may consider yourself a subject matter expert. When you start breaking it down into those individual components is when you start realizing, I'm pretty strong in every area, but this one right here, I'm probably a little bit weak in. And so a lot of instructors, when they find that they're weak in a little bit of areas, what we tend to do is gloss over that area. If it's an integral part of what we're trying to convey, then we're going to have problems on the output from the people who are attending the training.
Without a doubt. I mean, you leave out a key thing like that third sprocket I was talking about, and suddenly you're missing a bunch of gears. Yeah. Hill climbs become a lot harder. And it's true. I mean, I sometimes say, and this is not a braggadocious statement, it's because I've got a framework to present in. And again, it's the brain's framework. It's not, Tricky Dick's 5 steps to success or anything like that. It's literally how to get something past the amygdala, into your limbic system, up to your executive functions where you think about it and make the right decision. Through this process, it's almost like if I did an example or an analogy of cooking versus baking. Cooking is a little more free form. You can sit in the kitchen with a glass of wine, some music going, see what's in the pantry, add a little of this, a little of that, and kind of mold your meal. But if you're baking, you have to use the right ingredients in the right amount, in the right order. And communication is the exact same way. You can't just sit in there and blast a bunch of stuff out there and expect your audience of one or many to understand what you're saying. You have to have a defined point, and you have to chunk it, as you referenced, in a way that they can consume it, because we have this thing called a working memory. And it's literally just how much stuff you can keep track of in your mind at any given time. And without going into all the history, it's really 4 plus or minus 2 things. This is Miller's Law as redefined in the early 2000s. 4 plus or minus 2 concepts at any given time. And what that means is, on a super good day when the brain is firing and Michael's lecturing to me about something, I might remember 6 things he's talking about. On a bad day, 2. Now, the reason I bring that up is because I'm coming into this conversation with Michael with stuff already on my mind. I mean, I just got a speeding ticket. My dog is sick. I'm late with my bills. I'm fighting with my wife. My mind, my working memory, the stuff I can keep track of, is already busy with stuff. I've got a meeting coming up, busy with stuff. So while Michael's speaking and he's telling me all this other stuff, I'm going to only grab a couple things. And sometimes we narrow that down to what's called primacy and recency. So we might remember the first thing you said and the last thing you said, but all that stuff in the middle was lost. Well, that's because of your working memory, and that's because of the way the person communicated that information. You didn't make it about me, a benefit to me at the time. I've got other things going on in my head, and you just rattled off 38 facts. I can give you 2 of them back, most times. So what brain-centric design does, this framework, is help you take all these thoughts, organize them in a way where you're at max showing them 2 things, 2 concepts. But there's a way of aligning all these other details under these 2 concepts where somebody can remember. And I'll give just a real quick example. If I were to talk about Columbus sailing the ocean blue, and one of my concepts I wanted to talk about was 1492. If you hear that date, a lot of you might go, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But under 1492, we could put Portugal, we could put free trade, we could put the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. We could talk about food storage, all these things scaffolded under the concept of 1492. The other concept might be that free trade, because that's why they made the trip in the first place and all the things related to that. But there's a way of organizing information when you present it, even if it's a lot of information, to scaffold it under 2, what we call scaffolding thoughts, deliver that in a way, chunked, that the consumer, the audience, can remember it and see that it's all about them.
It's interesting that you just brought it to me, because I think that this is a leadership podcast. And so I think one of the things that leaders fail to recognize is that people don't come into a training with a clean slate, that they have other things competing, the memory, the working memory, and all these other things. We think they come in and they're this blank slate and therefore should absorb everything. And that's very short-sighted, and it doesn't really address how the brain works. Would you agree with that?
100%. That's the bane of all communication. I mean, we assume, because we're the subject matter expert in front of the course, in front of the class, that they're all here attentive, listening to me. And guess what? It's not about me. Everybody in that room learns at different speeds, has different things on their mind. And if you have not prepared your communication so that they can consume it, you'll lose. And we see that every day. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's called the behaviorist system. It's permeates our society. It's just the way we've learned. The easy way of saying that is the sit down, shut up, listen to what I say, I'll give you a test at the end. Or the dreaded, are there any questions? Which immediately throws everybody into an amygdala hijack, because you're hoping they don't call on you.
That's another thing I wanted to point out here, is that leaders have in their mind, and leaders and educators and trainers, no matter what industry, have in their mind that I really need to get engagement going at the very beginning. And so what's the first thing that people do? They start asking questions. And what is the brain's response when somebody goes and they do that, when they start this whole quote unquote learning process off with putting people on the spot, asking them questions at the very beginning?
The first day here, I'll let you listen to my mind. Oh, please don't call on me. I don't want to look stupid. I didn't focus on this stuff. We all do that. And like you say, most people will open up like asking questions. Michael, tell me about the learning yesterday. And you weren't prepared. You just you put them in a state of amygdala hijack, which is a real thing. I imagine you've spoken of it before, but for the listeners who haven't heard it before, you've got this little gatekeeper in your brain that forces about 80% of all communication into the reactive brain, not to where you're thinking about it, but when you're in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn state, which is not engagement. So the best way to open up any kind of communication is to present the information of what's going to be covered, anchor it in something they already know, like an analogy, let them know why it's personally beneficial to them, and then have them focus on that for a minute before you even start the presentation. And we do that through something called the challenge question. So I'll give you an example of how I would do that. Let's say if we were deep frying a turkey for Thanksgiving, I wanted to present to this group of people how to deep fry a turkey. I would introduce it very simply. I would say, hey, we're here to learn how to deep fry a turkey. It's basically like going to Kentucky Fried Chicken and getting a chicken basket, except much larger. It's in your backyard in 40 gallons of boiling oil. Not understanding this can cause all kinds of problems like burning down your house, disfiguring yourself, and so on and so forth. So before I even get started, Michael, how would learning how to deep fry a turkey make this next Thanksgiving the best ever for your family? And then I would be quiet. I would let you think about that. I might even ask you to write down an answer to yourself, but I could say it conversationally. And then what that does is prime the listener's mind for what's coming up, because you've said what we're talking about. You've anchored it in something we understand, in this case, Kentucky Fried Chicken. You've also given a very personal, emotional reason why they should pay attention. You don't want to burn down the house if you try this. You don't want to disfigure yourself if you try this. And then you direct their attention to the benefit of the presentation. How would learning how to do this make your next Thanksgiving great? And that gift of silence, not so much in a podcast, but when you're presenting information, that gift of silence lets somebody actually focus on that subject for a second. And then you come at them with a number of different perspectives. And when I say that, I mean, you want them to think about it. You want them to see it. You want to hear it. You want to have some motor functions, some small body movements that are associated with them. And then you want to give them time to reflect on it before you start asking questions. In fact, we always ask the same 3 questions, and they're so powerful because they literally are questions that work the way your brain works. So after that turkey presentation, I might say, I would say, what was surprising? That's it. That's the first question, is what was surprising? Because your answer, my answer, anybody's answer that's in the class is going to be, what was surprising for me? It's now personal about me. I'm not recalling anything. You've just shown me a bunch of stuff. I go, what was surprising? It's like, I didn't know you had to thaw the turkey out or it would explode. That might be surprising to me. What did I already know and now see in a different light? Well, I knew there was this thing, but it takes quite a bit of skill, some equipment, but done right, it ends up being a great thing. What do I still need help with? Gives me the opportunity to ask the person the question I want to know, not the one he wants to know or she wants to know. And that's important because the learning is all about me right here, right now, not that teacher or the facilitator or the trainers in the front of the class. It's that I'm in this class and I'm supposed to internalize this information. So make it about me, put it into my life. And this framework does that.
And I think it's important to point out, because I've been focusing on the training side of the things, and certainly it has a tremendous value. Folks, listen, we're going to put information on how you can find out more about this process, brain-centric, in our episodes page. But I want to share this with you. This is one of the persons that has taken the course, and they talk about using brain-centric has resulted in better employees in about 40% less time. This isn't, and I hate using this phraseology, but I think it gets a point across. this isn't a certificate meal type of training. It's not just a thing, hey, you attended and now you're good to go. This is where deep learning takes place. And when deep learning takes place, you get the desired employee, but it happens at a faster pace. So for you leaders out there that are struggling with getting your workforce up to speed, this right here is something that you really need to consider. But it's not just in the training world, though, is it, Rich? Because it also works in the education field, doesn't it?
It actually works in the life field.
Oh, that's great.
We originally did this for learning and development. It was originally presented for learning and development professionals to Nike. Originally, Kiran Omani, who I referenced earlier, had all this research, 40 years of research he'd put into this. And I'd had a great deal of myself on another angle. And when we got together and basically transcribed this so a normal person could consume it, I was working with Nike at the time on another project, and I asked them for a pilot. And I said, I've got this thing with a neuroscientist that I think would work for y'all. Literally, do you have a pilot, some training I could use? And they gave me this gig in the UK. And we did. We got these results you spoke of. And at first, we were just ecstatic because they were great results. It was a 12-week class. We did it in 8 weeks. And we did it when they did all the testing at the end of it. The students were retained far more information than any past class, and they had less students drop out. Then we were asked to do that in Asia. Same results. Different language, different cultures, different everything, same results. And we really knew we were on to something. And we had a couple other clients come on, and then we were invited to go to Columbia University in New York and present this to 40 educators and scientists from all around the world who were there to debunk the science, as they do. When you asked about a learning scientist, a lot of times we present stuff to see, are there holes in this, and then document it and find our way around it. But every time we used brain-centric, we had similar results. Typically, it was done in 30% less time. Always, we had more retention. Always, we had less attrition. And then when we started looking at these numbers and really dissecting them, it was because of the process that I spoke of earlier of understanding what your point is, what your big idea is. Through that process, you get rid of all the weeds. Going back to that bread example, you've got the right ingredients in the right amount at the right time. Well, if I looked in my pantry and I wanted to talk about all these things about bread, and suddenly I was going to talk about rosemary sprigs or olive oil, that has nothing to do with baking the bread. Those are accoutrements, after the word. They actually detract from the goal of that particular example of making a loaf of bread. That's after the bread. So the reason I can back up what you said to leaders listening saying you can do this faster is because you're doing a process you're probably not doing now. And that is really drilling down the information that gets you to that big idea. If I was going to show you how to deep fry that turkey, I'm not going to suddenly start talking about how to set a table or the time when I was in Portugal and got to be on a replica of the Pinta. It has nothing to do with the learning. And we do this naturally because we think it's conversationally and make it interesting. But then suddenly you said, I'm going to Portugal. And I'm thinking as a student, man, I've always wanted to go to Portugal. I hear the dollar goes real far there and they got great food. Suddenly I'm not learning anymore. You've taken me off track inadvertently just by doing what you thought was interesting, but it really just side railed me. So this process I'm talking about getting your information ready is called the nested egg. And I honestly use this nested egg 6 to 10 times a day. I'll use it before a phone call. I'll use it before I write an email. I'll use it before I present, obviously, so that I know specifically what people will walk away with from my communication, how I'll measure the success of my presentation. I do all this before I even build it. And what 2 things they must know to walk away with what I'm presenting. Now, those 2 things, like 1492 and trade, can have a lot of things underneath it, but they, to walk away with this understanding, need to know these 2 things. And then once I have that information that I really truly know my big idea and what I'm presenting specifically, I put it into a presentation model called the challenge wheel, also part of brain-centric. And it works every time with every person because guess what? We all have the same brain, meaning that brain processes information the same way in most humans. Obviously, there's neurodiverse folks and sidebars to that statement, but most of us have this same brain that processes information the same way. Things get kind of rattled in the middle of the brain when we start, say, talking about chili. Because if you and I and 100 of your listeners all decided to join a chili contest, we would all show up with a bowl of chili and we would have 100 different bowls of chili, because you've got a different way of making it. I've got a different way of making it. He uses braised elk. She doesn't use pinto beans. She uses, rancheros. There's so many variations on a theme. And that's what's so important to realize, is that we all have this different life experience, but we all have the same operating system. So if you want to get new information into a brain, follow the way the brain will accept that information. And that's what's documented in this model called brain-centric.
Well, and I think that's important for leaders, no matter the industry, to understand. If you want better results, then you or whoever you've designated in your organization need to become brain specialist. Not to do operations, but to address the brain appropriately in your training so that you get the results that you're looking for.
Oh, think about that. Even in today's world, AI, you can't fill up your gas tank or charge your car without somebody saying something about AI being a part of what that is. By definition, that's artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, meaning fake brain. They're trying to emulate the brain. They're trying to emulate thinking, and they're doing a great job with these neural networks and quantum and computing and all these other things. However, think how valuable your brain is as everybody's trying to replicate it. Thought today becomes currency. Thought today is unbelievably valuable. If you can think and ask the right questions and present things for engagement where people are engaged and are learning for themselves and are thinking for themselves, you'll be the MVP in your organization. Because people who can just recite facts, well, Google kind of took care of that. People who can be creative, well, it's scary time with AI doing what it does. If you can bridge that gap and be that person that AI is trying to emulate, meaning the thinker, the question maker, the person who understands new science, and the science that we're talking about is new. I mean, the decade of the 90s was really the decade of the brain. That's when we really started looking at it like a tool. And then as this thing progressed, we got this documented. The book came out about 6-7 years ago. My former boss, Paul Allen, started the Seattle Brain Institute. Suddenly, fMRI imaging is out there, basically x-rays of the brain showing you how a new piece of information enters the brain, where it travels to before somebody makes sense of it. It's a great time to be alive. And we're all walking around with the most powerful tool in the world in our skull, 3 pounds of goop hooked to miles of nerves that all are operating in much the same way. And knowing that secret decodering, how to put things together, is liberating. I mean, my life has changed beyond belief since I learned this. And again, today I'm on with 50 leaders from a Fortune 5, an NDA, I can't say who it is, but they are all learning this to train their trainers to train this way, because when we first did it for them about 6 years ago, it survived COVID, meaning that once we were all cut off, they were using this model on Zoom calls already, because we did this before COVID. And suddenly they're having engagement online. All of our courses survived COVID. They came out of it saying all of our people throughout the world need to present information this way, because this is what we saw. I can tell you this, though. This, too, was a big curriculum, about 16 weeks, and we narrowed it down to around 11 or 12. Can't remember right off the top of my head, but it was a substantial, say, 30% less time to present it. They ran it through what's called Kirkpatrick's levels of evaluation, which is a formal grading of presentation of information to other people. We not only aced that, but the savings to this company was $59,000 per class, because instead of attrition and having to rehire and having to retrain or people not understanding stuff, they could see it automatically be attributed to the people into the class. They were able to articulate that in their jobs. They enjoyed their jobs because they didn't have to memorize anything. They understood them. And it was fun. We literally say when we're teaching this, if we're not having fun, we're doing something wrong. And that's a cute statement to basically articulate the fact that if you are in an amygdala hijack, meaning you're in a state of boredom, stress, worry, concern, or entrapment, your learning ability will be severely hampered. But if you're in a state of joy or happiness, just like learning a hobby, you're open to new information and you can bring it in. So to your point, where leaders don't take into consideration, that my dog is sick or that the IRS is after me or whatever the situation is. In this model, you do, but there's a way of kind of quashing those things to where people see being in that room, listening to you is a benefit to them right now, and therefore they will be engaged.
And you used a word there. You used a word there that really stuck with me from the course, and that was the entrapment thing. And I think just about everybody can relate to this experience where you go to a quote unquote training session and you feel like you're being held hostage. You're there because you have to be. You're certainly not there because you're learning anything. And you know, since you're not learning anything, you're not enjoying yourself. And it really does feel like you're entrapped. Rich, I mean, to me, I think I've shared this with you before. If training doesn't change behavior, then it really wasn't training. It was just somebody talking in front of people. But you see changes in the way that people think after going through this. And because there's a change in the way that they think, there's change in the way that they perform their task. And that's where you know it's really meaningful.
Well said. I mean, that entrapment piece, there's emotional entrapment, situational entrapment. There's learned helplessness, the condition where a person believes they have no control over the situation. We've all felt that. There's a term we use sometimes called cognitive distortions, and that's patterns of thinking that are irrational or biased, leading to people feeling stuck or hopelessness, because all most people do, and this is kind of profound, but it's real and everybody will understand it. All most people do when they present is imitate the people who have presented to them in the past. My college teacher did it this way. The chief did it this way. Teacher did it this way. I'm going to do it this way, except I'm going to ask a funny question at the beginning and tell a joke.
Yep.
Variations on a theme, but we're all using the same basic behaviorist ideal, which is sit down, shut up. At the end, there's a test and I'll ask you some questions. And we all hate that. It doesn't work. And it's proven. If you look at our education system, there hasn't been a year where our score hasn't gone down. They keep trying to put perfume on the pig of let me present all this stuff and then give you a test. And what they need to do is present things for understanding where I can see this whole thing is about me and therefore I'll be engaged. And I can't be put in fear. I can't be trapped. I can't be bored. And there's ways of making people not bored in a class. And it's not by telling jokes. I mean, you can tell jokes, but that one doesn't work. And so it's all about brain now, and AI has pushed that agenda to no end, because if you aren't in control of your own brain, let alone others when you're in the communication business, coach, mentor, leader, anything, if you're in that business and you are presenting communications of consequence, then why wouldn't you learn how the brain would accept it so that you can be most successful in your endeavors? It's now available. It wasn't 10 years ago because it's a relatively new science and it's exploding. We're on every continent. Kieran is focusing all his efforts on the K-12. I'm focusing all my efforts on business, and the class that you spoke of, we just had our 700th graduate about a month and a half ago. It continues to replicate because those 700 people are presenting to dozens, if not hundreds of people on their own. And it's a wonderful situation when you realize that this 3 pounds of goop actually does have directions. They're relatively easy to learn. And once you kind of break through and see it, you can't unsee it. And that's the beautiful thing about brain-centric.
By way of caution, I think it's important that we caution leaders who are listening to this episode. Don't be fooled by the people who learned in spite of the way that you trained them. You didn't do a good job, but there are those anomalies who are going to learn even if you put them in a really bad environment, even if you don't present it in the way that you're talking about. You need to look at the class as a whole. in order to see that's where you see the difference, because you're going to reach a much larger group of people more effectively in less time using the brain-centric system than you are in the traditional system, correct?
No doubt. I'd put all my money. In fact, I do put my money on it contractually when I go to when I go to a business and they're going to engage us to write a curriculum or teach them primarily with writing the curriculum part, we will guarantee it because they will. If we can present this model the way we present this model, you will see better results. So long as they have a baseline, I've got to measure it against something.
Right.
And that's why I bring that up. A lot of times we're brought in to redo a curriculum, because the idea is in there. It's just muddied up and it's not obvious and it's not chunked up to where people can consume it.
All right. So folks, just so you know, Rich is a busy guy. So there's a couple things I want to get out before he's got to get off here. In your quote unquote free time, Rich, you decided to write a book called Surprised. What's the premise of that book?
That the mind loves novelty. This is part of brain-centric. And you know this, there are steps of a dance you do in brain-centric to make the dance a whole. Each one of those steps, while they have different names and monikers, are really a series of surprises. And there's so many types of surprises. It's kind of amazing. And the book goes into this deeply. But the primary purpose is that a surprise is the only thing that will take you out of an amygdala hijacked and put you into attention. Surprise is the only thing where your entire body, your whole of your brain, focuses all of its attention on whatever it is that surprised them. And there are pleasant ones, there are non-pleasant, there are happy, there are personal, there are literally dozens types of surprises. But we do this to keep engagement, to keep focus on a subject. And the surprise might be a small, simple surprise. I picked up a National Geographic the other day, and I read that Mount Vesuvius, they just dug up this 3,000-year-old vat of honey. When they took the lid off, they could eat the honey. It's still edible after 3,000 years.
Wow.
It's an amazing fact. Now, that had nothing to do with our conversation, but I just brought it up and you were paying attention. It's like, why is he bringing up honey that's 3,000 years old? Well, like a good presentation, your words in the minds of the learners can stick around for 3,000 years if you package it correctly. And that's how you could tie a surprise back into a learning lesson, to where I wasn't speaking about the brain. I was talking about honey in a vat that's 3,000 years old. Simple surprise, nothing revolutionary or mind-bending, but it did grab your attention. And I tied it back into what I'm speaking of. And the book is how to do that. The brain-centric book is the science brain-centric. Surprised is breaking up those little elements into what they are and showing you how to craft them so that when you're speaking to somebody, just like a video game or a news story at television at 6 at night, there are tons of little things that happen that lift you up, make you feel good, make you pay attention, make you stay around. And surprise is how to do that with each one of those elements in the brain.
And folks, I can't recommend both of those books highly enough. We're going to have links to both of them in the episode notes. But as we wrap up, Rich, can I just give you my key takeaways from here, just so that you have a chance to correct me in case I got them wrong?
Absolutely.
Number one, folks, it has to go beyond memorization. It's not enough. People must be taught how to think.
That's it. We don't even refer to this as teaching. We refer to it as facilitating a thinking system.
All right. And then we should measure success by what they know, not by what we delivered, because those two things don't always equal out.
Right. Yeah. You'll deliver a lot of stuff, but you'll measure success prior to even building your communication on what they'll walk away with, that you can witness or monitor, not assess, but see, feel.
Going back to Kirkpatrick pyramid there, the very top tier is what we should be shooting for. And then finally, folks, this is for those leaders out there, those aspiring leaders. If you want to influence the brain and the decisions made by the brain, then you need to have an understanding of the brain and how it learns.
That's it. That's the secret to success.
If you want to get an understanding of the brain, go and read the books. And I'm going to throw this out there. I listen to a lot of books. I read a lot of books. Brain-centric, I did both. And the Audible version of it was fantastic. I mean, fantastic the way that it was put together. So I know it's on Audible, and I'm sure it's probably available in libraries and that type thing, but I encourage you to do it. Rich, I know you got to go, but I do want to say thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. Keep doing what you're doing, man. You're making a difference, a legacy difference. Something that's going to be years from now, people are going to be able to trace their family tree of change back to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. I want to say, wow, that's lofty praise. I thank you so much for the opportunity, for what you're doing for leaders with this podcast, and for having me as a guest today. I really, truly appreciate it.
All right, folks, we sure thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this episode, and we sure as heck hope you did, because the brain's really important if you haven't figured that out, be sure to follow the podcast on your favorite podcast provider. You can also find this episode and all previous episodes on our website at commandpresence.net/podcast. Also, check us out on LinkedIn, and we're working our way over to Instagram and Facebook as well. If you can, follow us on there. As always, we want to give a huge thank you to Command Presence Training and the Command Presence Leadership Institute for their support of this podcast. And folks, as you go through this next week, please remember, be the leader you wish you had.